wood with his fingers.
The music I could stand, but that fucker had to wear those ugly rainbow caps and everything.
He grumbled while I reflexively snorted at the mental image his comment created. The whole avoidance thing was making my chest feel lighter, so I continued. Elias's first wet dream was of Freddy Krueger, I offered appreciatively, and his back rose and fell with his soft laughter. He looked much better than when I left him on the balcony, and I was endlessly relieved as I relaxed my cheek into my arms and bathed in his amusement. This wasn't so bad. Maybe everything could be salvaged, and Edward didn't feel toward me what I felt toward Phil. Secretly, this had been a festering panic since I left his house.
I'm not shocked,
he admitted after his laughter subsided with a shrug. We spent a few moments gazing into one another's eyes. He still looked so exhausted, and for a moment, I allowed myself to imagine that it was November again, and we were sharing our friends' most sordid embarrassments, to keep each other awake. Good times.
Jasper had his tongue pierced, and it got so infected and gross that he almost had to have surgery.
He offered, quirking an eyebrow. This really didn't surprise me much either. Alice said that Rosalie wet the bed until she was 12, I countered, and he grimaced, finally sitting up and shoving his hands into his pockets.
Everyone knows that, Bella.
He shook his head, still grinning lightly, as he fished something out of his pocket, and began fidgeting with it absently.
It's a fucking miracle the name Pee-Pee Rosalie didn't stick with her after junior high,
he mused distractedly. I couldn't see the object as he passed it from hand to hand, but I caught a brief glimpse of shimmer from the scant moonlight. I sat up with a sigh. Avoidance time was over. What's going on, Edward? I whispered dreadfully, and the mirth that was present in his eyes vanished entirely. He began chewing his lip and bouncing his knee beneath the table without meeting my gaze as I observed his anxious behavior warily. I allowed him as much time as I could possibly bear. He stared at his hands intently for many moments, playing with the shiny object, as the sounds of the river made everything appear so peaceful. It was a lie. The avoidance was a lie, and I wanted to know what the hell was going on. Before I could completely lose it and snap at him impatiently, he sighed long and agonized, dropping his forehead to the wood of the table in surrender.
I'm so fucking tired, Bella,
he admitted quietly without raising his head. His voice was so thick with pain and defeat that I decided middle ground gazebo rules no longer applied. I tried to scoot cautiously to his side, but ended up flying over the distance between us and grasping his shoulders, in the tightest hug I could possibly manage. He stiffened momentarily, but eventually relaxed, and lifted an arm to snake around my waist. I didn't deserve any of his affection, truth be told. I had hurt him over and over again, and I wasn't even worthy of his polite conversation, let alone his tenderness. But he squeezed me tightly to his side, finally raising his head and planting a kiss on my temple before nuzzling his nose into my hair softly. It made me feel impossibly worse. I opened my mouth with the intention of apologizing once again. I would have said it a million times, and it still wouldn't have made up for any of it, but apologies were all I had. Phil never once apologized. Maybe this made me less of a monster. If he was willing to forgive me, then maybe eventually I could forgive myself. Unfortunately, I never had the opportunity.
I'm leaving,
he mumbled into my hair, stroking it softly down my back with his fingers. I blinked in confusion, gazing out over the river and trying to understand his words. Leaving? You decided to move out? I frowned. It made sense. If he had been caught skipping class, then he and Carlisle likely had another falling out. I couldn't expect him to stay in such an uncomfortable environment for my sake alone. It was upsetting, but I reasoned that it really wouldn't change much. I was going to assure him that I wouldn't make good on my threat to seek therapy, until I felt him shake his head.
Not exactly,
he admitted, finally lifting his face from my hair to meet my gaze. My frown deepened as I pivoted my body toward his. His dark eyes were apprehensive, boring into mine, and his grip on my waist tightened.
I'm going to Chicago,
he breathed remorsefully. too far was the first reaction my mind could successfully produce. I simply couldn't fathom that kind of distance between Edward and me, and my strangled "why?" was the only response I could coherently convey through the sudden constriction of my chest. He abruptly pulled my head to his shoulder, hugging me tighter as he spoke into my hair. He began telling me about a conversation he had with Emmett. Something about Emmett going to find his birth parents last year. I tried to wrap my head around it, but he was talking so quickly. As he spoke, it became an apparent and desperate justification. Even I could tell that much, though I couldn't understand why. Nothing he said made any sense. The only words that completely penetrated my shock and panic were,
"I'm going to find my mother."
I had returned to my side of the bench. Middle ground gazebo rules had returned in full force. I hadn't spoken for a long while, and my mind was still trying to capture the gravity of Edward's departure. "Do you think how long?" I stammered dumbly, my words as unorganized as my thoughts. Luckily, Edward knew me well enough to understand what I was attempting to ask.
"I don't know,"
he answered uncertainly, as a light sprinkle of rain began falling. That answer was so ridiculously unacceptable that my head abruptly swung to meet his gaze. "You don't know?" I tried to inject my voice with venom and anger, but it came out as a pathetic sob. His eyes were once again fixed on his hands, the object gone, and his hair dampened from the humidity of the misty air.
"Maybe, before school is out,"
he offered with furrowed brows, and a calculating expression at his hands. He had no idea what he was doing. "I'll go with you," I pleaded desperately, and his head began shaking before I could even finish. "I can't talk to Esme, and she'll—"
"Fuck, Bella,"
he sighed, finally meeting my gaze, and I knew he'd never let me.
"We both know you can't come,"
he added in a rational voice, "and you know things are bad when Edward becomes your voice of reason." So I conceded in that respect, but there were other straws to grasp. "What if it makes it worse for you, Edward? What if she does it again?" I hedged reluctantly, and the brief flash of pain in his eyes assured me that he understood what I was getting at.
"Maybe she will,"
he replied flatly with a tight shrug, like it wouldn't bother him nearly as much as we both knew it would. Then I really would have to track her down to spit in her face. At best. Still, he wasn't going to surrender to me anymore. This idea of his was either really admirable, or completely insane, and there was no way of knowing which. But Edward was determined to find out. I realized then, as I regarded his set jaw and resolute stare, that this was one of those things that he had to do. On his own. For better or worse. It wasn't something I could help him accomplish, and it pained me to no end. I wondered, was this how he felt when I went to Phoenix? I was praying the fear I felt wasn't evident in my eyes as I met his. "Before summer starts," I reiterated in a commanding tone that shook despite my every effort. He nodded, and the motion made the lock of his hair fall, obstructing his eye. I reached across the distance to push it away. "Promise me," I whispered pleadingly. His fists were clasped so tightly on the table that his knuckles had turned white.
"I'll be home before summer starts, I promise,"
he assured me, and even though his voice rang deep with conviction and honesty, it did nothing to assuage my fear. I nodded, and he slowly lifted himself from the bench. I was frozen in place. It didn't make sense for him to do this now. He was too tired, and it was too rainy and late for him to drive safely. I couldn't understand his justification for not waiting, but I feared that voicing this concern would make me seem selfish and unsupported when I begged him to stay, so I didn't, and the pit of my stomach twisted and churned. The rain was coming down harder now, beating on the shingled roof of the gazebo, as he stepped behind me and pulled me to him. His strong arms wrapped around my shoulders, while his face found my neck, and kissed it sweetly. I refused to say goodbye, and he must have shared my sentiment on it, because he didn't either. Instead, he simply held my back to his chest, planting cold kisses around the necklace I wore, and whispering in my ear that he loved me. I managed to smile and tried my best not to cry when I told him, "I love you, too." It must have been hard enough without adding the burden of my emotions on top of his own. When his arms released me, he removed his jacket and draped it around my shoulders.
Cover yourself from the rain when you leave,
he ordered, correctly predicting that I was going to stay until he departed. I nodded numbly without meeting his gaze. I wanted to spare him the guilt of seeing the pain and fear in my eyes. My eyes remained fixed on the river, and I could feel him retreating from the gazebo without looking over my shoulder. It felt like a chunk of myself had ripped away from my body, and suddenly, I was freezing cold. My teeth began chattering. And there wasn't really a monumental moment where I knew he was gone. Truthfully, I sat for a long time, and still expected to turn my head and see him behind me, but I couldn't feel his electricity. I could only feel cold and wet and dread. 1 month. After so long sitting alone in the gazebo, the moon was completely covered by clouds, and the darkness felt suffocating. I lifted my stiff and shivering body from the bench, and clutched Edward's jacket tightly around my torso. I wanted to go home, but my only home just drove away in his car, to seek out the only person that could hurt and victimize him even worse than I could. I would have to settle for second best. The rain pounded on my hair as I darted across the yard, and the water on the ground splattered with every step, soaking the bottom of my jeans as I approached the house. It didn't escape my notice that Edward's Volvo was absent from the Cullens' driveway. I knocked loudly on the door, waited 5 seconds, then pounded loudly once again. My teeth were still chattering violently when it finally opened. I blinked the raindrops away from my lashes, clutching the leather jacket tighter, ignoring the voice suddenly calling my name from across the yard, and met the weary and anguished gaze of Dr. Cullen. He stepped aside wordlessly as I entered, and then closed the door behind me with a soft click, silencing the roar of the rain outside. We shared a brief stare, and even though he never opened his mouth, it was easily the longest conversation we ever had. His sorrowful eyes spoke volumes into mine. As I stood dripping wet and shivering in his bright foyer, I finally realized that Dr. Cullen probably loved Edward just as much as I did, and that was saying an awful lot. I think he probably had the same realization, because his gaze shifted to one of understanding. As he regarded my numb and trembling form, our mutual love and concern for Edward made us kindred in a way that no one else would likely ever understand. This was probably why he didn't object, as he watched me climb the staircase to the third-floor bedroom as close to home as I could possibly get. I instinctively knew that Carlisle wouldn't make me leave, and no matter what Esme or anyone else had to say about it, I had no plans of doing so until Edward was home, too.